forum. Again, if you haven't yet introduced yourself in the chat, we would love to see where you're calling in from and also what brought you here today. Just a couple.
I just want to comment that Connie says Laura Esserman because I sent her my link because that's what I had. But that is really Connie Lehman, not Laura Esserman. I am Laura Esserman, and that is Connie Lehman.
Laura, appreciate it. That's fun. I can be Laura Esserman for the day. I like that.
That's good. You can answer all my emails too.
Just a
great.
couple housekeeping items, and then I'll introduce you, Connie. I have your bio, so I'm going to give you a nice intro. But we love to make these interactive, so we want to hear from you what your questions are. Connie has some slides that she'll show, Dr. Lehman, I should say. But we also love to answer your questions, so put those in the chat. And at the end, we'll also have some time for Q&A. But if you're not speaking, please do mute yourself. We do record these meetings so that we can share them for those who aren't able to join. And then there is a short post-meeting survey at the end. Let's see, and I've kind of gone through, again, we've got topics across the spectrum from past forums that are available on our YouTube channel. So please do take a peek at those. We'll put the link in the chat as well. But for this month, we have an exciting topic around mammographic AI for breast cancer risk assessment. And we have Dr. Connie Lehman, who is joining us today. She is the founder of Clarity. She is also a professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School and a breast imaging specialist. And she really has dedicated her life to the advancement of breast imaging and early detection of breast cancer, and specifically in the imaging space as well. So I don't know, Laura, if you want to give any additional intro. I know you two have worked together for quite some time.
Yeah, Connie is sort of one of the leaders of the new movement in radiology to try and think about innovation and how to improve screening and personalize it and reduce the burden of screening on people instead of sticking with the status quo, one size fits all. A real important voice who will, of course, I believe this will be the future of radiology that she is leading, and has been very interested in prevention. And while there are many models for looking at predicting how mammographic density predicts risk, and she was involved in the original work with MIT, she is the first to develop something commercializable that is FDA approved that we can actually use and implement. And we are in the process of getting a repository to collect our data to be able to do this, and hopefully towards the beginning, the Q1 of like January, February of this coming year, we will have this implemented in the trial and have it be a part of our risk assessment. So we are really excited to work with Connie, and she is going to tell us a little bit about the work that she has been doing. And as I said, when you have questions, you can put them in the chat. If we see them, we'll interrupt and ask them. We want to make this interactive, as Allison said. So Connie, welcome. Oh, I see you got who changed the name? Did you do that, Allison?
Oh, my name was magically changed. I'm back to being me. So Laura, thank you so much, and to your team for the invitation. It's really been looking forward to spending some time with you all this evening. I'd love to go through the slides at sort of a quick clip, because what I really love doing in these types of forums is having the discussion. So, but I do want to give you enough background so you feel like you at least know, where we've been and where we're going. And then I also want to say I love being here because I'm also a subject in the wisdom trial. I have loved being a subject in the wisdom trial. I filled out all my forms. Got all my stuff, and I said I was fine being randomized to whatever I would be randomized at. But with my risk, I was recommended to get a mammogram every 2 years, which I was really happy about because it felt like it made sense to me. I will tell you, do not be the division chief of breast imaging at Mass General trying to get everyone to understand you're only going to get a mammogram every 2 years. I was like bludgeoned to death by my primary care doctor, by the institution, everyone like, you are, so overdue for your mammogram. So all I can say is there's a lot of pressure for what we tell women to do, and I just think that what Laura, your team, and you are doing is absolutely extraordinary, way ahead of its time. So we're all hoping we can catch up and add to the conversation and add to the vision that you've had from the beginning, that surely we can do better with how we image, because this is where we've been stuck for so long. I mean, and sometimes I feel that this was the message I was being given. You know, if you haven't had a mammogram, you need more than your breast examined. When I made what I thought was a really informed decision to have a mammogram every 2 years, they were like, you're absolutely crazy, and what's the matter with you? And so we haven't changed that much. I mean, we've really been stuck in age-based screening,
Who
and
made
we've
this?
been
Dan Copens?
isn't that great? I tease Bob Smith at the American Cancer Society about this all the time. This was one of their first ads in the 1970s when they were trying to get women to really engage in screening mammography. And at that time, they had a baseline at 35. So if you're a woman over 35, be sure to schedule your mammogram, or have your head examined. And then they said, oh, did we say 35? We meant 40. Maybe we meant 50. We're not sure. Okay, we mean 40, but we're not sure if we mean every year or every other year. So what we do know is that while we're still struggling with how to screen women, we do know that people have embraced the idea that risk assessment is a critical metric in access to what could be life-saving care, either, better methods for early detection, or more informed methods and more precise methods of risk reduction. But we're a little bit limited in how we assess that risk. And so we have the very common experience that Katie Couric, in her article, Why Not Me, said, no one in my family had breast cancer. She was so surprised when she had her diagnosis. Or this, young woman in her 30s, no family history of cancer. She didn't see her diagnosis coming, because a lot of women are diagnosed with breast cancer. Approximately 85% don't have a family history, or certainly not one that would call attention to them. And north of 90% have no known genetic mutation. And also breast cancer itself, since that poster from the 1970s, it's really changing. We're seeing trends, we're seeing differences across races. We're seeing younger women being diagnosed with very concerning cancers, and yet we're still sort of stuck in this age density traditional risk model paradigm. When we started to study with Regina Barzilay and her team at MIT these risk models, it also gave me the opportunity to go into our database and understand more about the traditional risk models. And I was really surprised to find out that, just as we just looked at the basic data of our Hispanic patients, 20% were assessed as increased risk, where they would have had access to, for example, screening MRI. But 50% of our patients who identified as white were labeled as increased risk. So we were seeing these differences, and they didn't track with the cancer incidence. So the more we studied the traditional risk models, the more we realized we just need to do more. My colleague David Jones at Harvard has written some, I think, very insightful messages across the full spectrum of risk-based medicine, and reconsidering the use of race correction in clinical algorithms, whether it's for breast cancer or renal failure or other diseases. And certainly breast density has gotten an incredible amount of attention, federal law now, so that 100% of states, all of our states, must inform women of their breast density. The problem is it's a very crude technique. 50% roughly of women are told that they have dense breast tissue. And we now have 32 states and rising who are requiring their insurers to pay for MRI in women with dense breast tissue at some level. And obviously, state by state, that has a very different impact on women, where their deductible or copay is so high that it's not really helpful to have the insurance quote pay for the MRI, and in other states where it's much easier to get access to that. But what we really wanted to do was to go far beyond density. We knew density was a way to pick up some very faint signals, and the research on density from the 70s, 80s, and 90s is it's great. It's like the horse whisperers, like we're seeing things in density that are important, but now we have computer vision and we have the power of AI, so we can extract so much more digital data than breast density alone. It's very similar to these other areas that Laura and the Wisdom team are so expert at, where you just have so much data about the genetics of a patient or all the different, aspects of their tissue, so much data. We really need to leverage AI to translate and amplify that data into usable information. And this field of computer vision and deep learning is really exciting for me. I'll end up talking too long, so I won't tell all the stories I love telling, but Fei Li wrote a book, The Worlds I See. She's at Stanford now. She was a brilliant visionary in the domain of computer vision. She developed ImageNet, and ImageNet was the birth of computer vision because there were so many labeled images. And just one example was images of labeled as cats and dogs. You can train the deep neural network to learn whether it's a cat or a dog. And then when you give it totally new images of cats and dogs, it will correctly identify which is a cat and which is a dog. So we use exactly those same off-the-shelf software deep neural network packages. And instead of giving it cats and dogs, we gave the software that we were training images from women that developed breast cancer in the subsequent 5 years from their mammogram and those that did not. So rather than label cat and dog, mammogram positive for cancer in 5 years, mammogram negative in cancer for the subsequent 5 years. And then we were able to show, and we did a lot of different studies showing which areas of the breast were being attended to by these AI deep learning models, that you could actually produce a calibrated 5-year breast cancer risk score. So when we decided then, we had this research model, Mirai, that was developed with the collaboration between Regina Barzilay and Adam Yala and their team at MIT and ours at Mass General, that we would develop a commercial product. So it's a longer story than anyone wants to hear, but very long story. We went outside to develop a very diverse database rather than just depending on the Mass General images. We collected data and images with 5-year known outcomes from around the world, and then trained a model that we could then go down the pathway to have it globally available through a commercial pathway. And lots of people have been doing this. Christoph Lee and his colleagues wrote a really nice systematic review of the risk factor traditional clinical models, which is shown on this first line, and then the image-only AI models, of which there are several, all of them, but our Clarity model is still in the research realm now. And then a model that combined the two. And it was very, very consistent that we basically, with our current technology, and we're just at the beginning, this is going to get better and better, but with our current technology, when you use an image-only AI risk model, you're going to bump up your ability to predict risk by about a point, which doesn't seem like a lot, going from 0.61 to 0.72, but it actually can have a high impact when we look at how that then is able to separate women out accurately from low to intermediate to high risk. And we've also found, as did others in the field, when you combine the two together, there wasn't very much additive impact from the other risk factors, these traditional clinical risk factors. I think there's still a lot of work to do in this area. There was a little bit of a bump up, but not a lot. And I think it's because many of those traditional clinical risk factors that we're adding in is already apparent on the mammogram. If a woman's had a prior biopsy, if she's had prior surgery, if she's gained weight, if she's lost weight, if she's been on hormones pre or postmenopausal, we were already showing that you could train models to identify those factors already from the mammogram itself. And the FDA required that we were very rigorous. For the other FDA AI models in mammography, there were very small training sets that were used to demonstrate performance. We had 5 geographically distinct sites, over 75,000 images with known 5-year outcomes. And we had to show both the performance, a time-dependent AUC allowing for patients that dropped out, as well as is it calibrated. So does 2% mean 2%, or does 2% just mean you're lower risk than someone that's 5%. So the calibration was a really important part for the FDA. And so now we've entered in this new domain in healthcare where everyone has a pathway with this FDA de novo authorization where you can take images and studied, appropriately with appropriate clinical validation from the image in a otherwise healthy woman. You can predict future risk, not only future risk of breast cancer, but future risk of other diseases as well. So we're very excited about this domain of radiomics adding into everything that we have been behind on in the developments in genomics and proteomics, et cetera. And so I'm just going to show a couple slides of some of the ways that we've tested and evaluated this. We have a very large global database, and so we wanted to compare how well did density separate out women with a higher risk of cancer from those with a lower risk. And you would look at these columns here. So this first column, not dense, for all exams, 2.7% of the women in that group of not dense breast tissue developed breast cancer in the subsequent 5 years. Those with dense breast tissue, it was 3.2%. So statistically, that is a significant difference, but is not as dramatic a difference as when you use the full complexity of the mammogram. And that would be shown with this last column. So if we have those that have an AI risk score that's under 1.7% for 5 years, the cancer rate in those patients 5 years after the index mammogram was 1.3%. For those that were intermediate, it was 2.7%. And those that scored higher than 3% on the AI risk model, we found a rate of 5.9% cancers developing in the 5 years subsequent to the mammogram. So we're finding that this is just going to be a more precise way of separating women out compared to density. And we're also pretty excited, going back to that concept of the American Cancer Society saying a baseline at 35. I'm open to a baseline younger. We're certainly screening for cervical cancer in different ways. I could, with the data that we know, if we had a mammogram at 30, had a risk assessment, saw if she was average, saw her again at 35, and then at 40. And at 40, we're making a decision if she needs to continue with her mammography, or could she wait till 45? And while for some people we've been so, wedded to annual mammography for everyone 40 and older, I really think this is giving us another piece of information that we could hopefully guide women in a more precise way. I also think, with some caveats about the design of this study, that we're clearly seeing that our young patients, the women under 40, we can separate those out with the AI risk scores of their future risks. So these were all women that had their risk scores that were under 40. We can clearly identify this group at high risk that has a cancer risk that is even higher than those at high risk in the 40 to 49 year group. And so these red bars are those that were assessed as greater than a 3% 5-year risk of breast cancer. And those are the patients that I'm really, really focused on. I'm really interested in how we can identify them earlier and intervene in more thoughtful and more precise ways. The last part that I wanted to share is just how excited I am.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
I think one of the questions, go back to that slide. I think part of the problem with any kind of screening, mammographic screening, is your highest false positives are in the 40s or in the late 30s, and finding little things and finding DCIS or finding stuff like that. So the real question is, is it better for us to sort of use the genetics as the first screen to get the mammo AI? You know what I mean?
Yep. I think it's a great question. It's one of the things we grapple with. I'm sort of in the camp of thinking that we have the cancers that track with genetic mutations, and we have cancers that are truly sporadic, and that we cannot capture, at least with what we know today about genetic testing. We're just not capturing them. And we are having these sporadic breast cancers in women under the age of 40. What we've really been studying are those with the genetic mutations. I mean, that's how we find them. We think of the young women as those that have.
Well, not just that. I mean,
Yeah.
PRS for specific types, like ER negative or ER positive, or those people who meet the criteria. I mean, there's much more than just mutations, right?
Yep. And so some of the work that we've done that the BCRF has helped support is looking at, okay, genetic mutations aside, what about polygenic risk scores? What if you sort of had three different groups? You had your, high penetrant genetic mutations, you had your polygenic risk score profile, and then you had these that are picked up by more the radiomic approach of this, whatever this last basket is, of the more sporadic cancers. And I think those are the studies that need to be done. I don't have a sense now of, if you took all cancers, how many would be captured by a polygenic risk score approach versus an AI image approach. I don't
No, but I
know
mean
the
by
answer to
like
that.
the ones that you screen with mammo AI density, the people who meet a certain criteria of having some kind of polygenic risk or mutation.
Yeah, I don't know what I think those studies are important, but I don't know what that is. And Laura, you probably know this, but I don't know it. What percent of women who are diagnosed with breast cancer before the age of 40 um, are sort of in that bucket of no known risk factors? Like, so this sporadic cancer, the surprise cancer.
Mm, we probably can figure that out, but it's like, again, it is surprising what a good job Wisdom 1.0 did at finding the highest risk people. I mean, it's like tenfold, I mean, you could
Mhm.
find, I mean, that doesn't mean that we've caught everybody, of course, in that high risk group. And again, it depends. But like, I don't know. I'm not interested in finding shoplifter cancers that lead to a lot of aggressive surgery that,
Yeah.
these are little bitty things that aren't going to kill you or don't need surgery in the first place. So trying to figure out how not to, I think that's the challenge, right?
100%. And that's where we really want to use this as the balance of, not of reducing the, over screening, reducing the over diagnoses, reducing the
Right.
waste that's involved and the harms that are involved with over screening and over diagnosis. But making sure in reducing all those false positives, et cetera, we're not having too many women fall through the cracks. The other domain where I think it's going to be really interesting is with these patients that have these genetic predispositions, that we are not only trying to screen better, but we're also trying to intervene to reduce their risk. And that's what I'm probably most excited about these days. So this is a study where we showed that, years before the cancer is diagnosed, we start to see the slope of those that develop cancer, shown by the red line, is distinctly different than the slope shown by the blue line of women who don't develop breast cancer. So even 6 years prior, there's a significant difference between the two groups. But what's even more relevant is that the slope is different. So it's not just what is your risk score now, but what was it 2 years ago? And what we're believing, because again, when we go back, like Jack Cusick did studies where he showed density changes in women that went on tamoxifen. So, using that same logic of what we've done with AI, extracting more digital data than just the density, is could you show one, just every domain of risk reduction? Can you show that you're actually reducing the risk score on the mammogram? And can we be more precise in what medications women are taking, how much they're taking, and when it's not working, if there's sort of a breakthrough, continued increase in their risk score, a different approach to take. So precision, not just in
Do you
screening,
have
but in
data
risk
as
reduction.
that it's a mutable marker, modifiable marker for risk when people take risk reduction? Do we have that yet or not?
We do not have that yet in the AI, which is what I
Well,
want to do
yeah, we
next.
could do that in Wisdom for sure.
That would be fantastic, because that I think that'd be a great BCRF approach too, because we're getting more and
Yeah,
more.
well, that's great. I mean,
It's great.
I mean, so do you think, Connie, that it's going to be, in general, it's sort of a black box, but like then you can sort of reduce it to like a number or something in it that really becomes something that is modifiable.
Yes. Yeah. I really do. And the reason why I do is just seeing that, the scores change over time that are we know that the scores are not static, that they are dynamic. They do change over time. We know that density is impacted by interventions to reduce breast cancer risk. So that's been pretty consistent in different studies. In fact, there were a few times where different big pharma companies were using density as their surrogate for impact of their risk reduction strategy. So it like wasn't good enough, and we think the AI risk model, we think it's a very strong hypothesis that they will be good enough and they will be able to show these differences. So, but those studies have to be done. We haven't done those studies.
Yeah, well, that's actually something that as we implement, we for sure should do.
Yep, that
So,
sounds
but
perfect.
100%.
And a lot of the BCRF investigators are very enthusiastic and interested in that domain. The last thing is, you may all have heard, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and Wild West talk about using the mammogram to predict cardiovascular risk. And it's gotten completely out of control. There's a breast arterial calcification score. All it was authorized by the FDA to do is to tell the radiologist that is a calcification, that is in an artery, that is in the breast. So you could train, a pigeon to do that. You could train a high school student to do that. That's all the FDA quote authorized for the breast arterial calcification score, but they're marketing it saying, come to our breast imaging center. Not only will we assess your breast health, but we will also let you know about your cardiovascular disease risk. So it's really gotten out of control. It's quite concerning, but there is a there. So there are a lot of signals in a woman's breast tissue that relate to her risk for cardiovascular disease. And obviously an incredibly important disease in women. 40% of women skip their regular screenings for their cardiovascular health. And we think we can leverage how much more engaged women are in breast cancer screening and how much more aware. If anything, they're overestimating constantly their risk of breast cancer, and they're constantly completely underestimating their risk of cardiovascular disease. So we are combining databases with Callum McRae at Brigham, who is a brilliant cardiologist and has been very enthusiastic about our work in AI and mammograms and breast cancer risk in a project to predict cardiovascular disease from the image. And so that's it. I'll just close that we're so many of us in the field are in Laura's jet stream. We're seeing that her vision of more personalized screening and reducing false positives and capturing cancers in smarter, more targeted, more precise ways is so important. And being able to be a radiologist in this domain and be living in a time where we have AI now through computer vision to see things that my human eye and my human brain can't see is so exciting. And it really all started with Regina Barzilay and her lab and my team at Mass General, and then evolved from there with so many fantastic supporters and people engaged in this work. So I hope we can enter into some fun Q&A. And again, thanks so much for inviting me, and just really happy to be here.
Thanks, Connie. It's interesting. Javid Mosley, does cardiology oncology, had said to me that, because we normally really think about people, usually healthier women get breast cancer. And he said, oh no, there's this huge link with breast cancer and heart disease, which I am still not convinced of. Although I do think that this kind of database, we now have 100,000 women in our database. And, I think because we have all the PRS, there's also really good polygenic risk scores for predicting heart disease. So we had that, plus we had some other features. The Mammo AI, because we'll have that as part of the database, I think that could be super exciting, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, again, the breast is just, to me, it's just such an interesting part of the woman's body because it just records so much when we again look at these signals that we kept getting from people that studied the mammogram, and when the grad students at MIT didn't have the cancer outcomes, but they had the images and they had a lot of clinical information. And they said, you know, we can predict a woman's race from the mammogram, her age, her menopausal status, parity, like all of these reproductive health factors. They leave some messages behind in the breast tissue, inflammation. And you think about, you know, we have arteries and veins and lymphatics and different types of fat and epithelial and these, you know, glandular elements. There's just a lot of information. And in that whole domain of a woman's phenotype is something that I'm just finding, you know, really, really exciting.
You know, we have in the genetic information have adjusted and changed the way we look at genetic risk based on whether you're, you know, Latina or Asian or white or black. And has that been something that has been, is there a different algorithm based on race or ancestry, or not really? Or you don't know?
Well, you know, what we ended up doing with Mirai was we didn't control for any of these factors. We decided we were really just going to go in the direction of an image only model. And then other groups have, when you do this sort of warm up training with your model, you can teach it to do easier tasks, like just teach it to do breast density, just to get it used to the idea. I'm looking at mammograms and I'm trying to predict something. But then some groups said, and we're going to tell it things we don't want it to learn. And I'm always like, be really careful with what you say you don't want it to learn. Like groups that say, well, we don't want it to learn race because we don't want it to be biased. I was like, I don't know. Like, let it decide that. Like, let it decide if it actually should be learning race from the mammogram as it relates to the breast cancer. You know, so I'm just more in the camp in the AI domain of let the model learn on its own. Deal with biases later. You can figure out and test for those, but don't do too much human engineering. Like I think the worst AI model would be if I sat there and showed it how to find calcs and how to find distortions and how to find masses. That could be fine for a 1 year risk, which is really just finding, you know, missed cancers that
Yeah.
were evident in hindsight. But yeah, so we'll see.
Other
There's
question.
one, yeah, there's one question. The first question that came in was about polygenic risk scores and how or why do they change over time?
It's going to be a
Your
Lara
your
question.
your polygenic risk doesn't necessarily, well, your genes don't change. Well, there's two things. You get a set of genes that you inherit, and those tend not to change, right? How we understand them and how we combine them, you know, we continue to learn. Like there, we now have um, a polygenic risk score for African American women, and it includes, it's like 80,000 genes. It's very complicated, but it's different from the polygenic risk score that predicts, you know, the majority of cancers, which are hormone positive and slower growing. Why? Because most of the databases included European women and not Black women. So those scores obviously develop some bias, but we are increasing, you know, we have these increased ability to have much broader populations looking at this. So being able to do things that are more ancestry based, you know, not necessarily even self declared race. Now, the other thing though that can happen, which, you know, there's something, you know, your genes can be modified. These are what they call epigenetic, meaning that there's some event, maybe it's a exposure to a chemical or something else that can change your genes over time. Now, one of the things that we have added and are looking at, there are much more sophisticated ways to look at the impact of plastics and other, you know, um, environmental exposures, you know, where people live and where they grow up, and trying to learn history. It's complex, but those are things that can change. And so we at the moment are not pulling in the epigenetic risk routinely, but we are starting to, Kim Badal is working on trying to understand, you know, particular plastics and particular, you know, PFA, or other things that stay and remain in the blood, or exposure, to other carcinogens. It's been very difficult in breast cancer. We have not shown, people had a strong belief that it would make a big difference and that pollution or exposure to chemicals definitely would cause breast cancer. This has not been proven yet. And I think one of the reasons is because we can't put it into context, a context of, genetic susceptibility. Sometimes one group of people is just more susceptible, and there, for sure, you're going to see the impact of genetic risk, right? But I think this is one of these things that we don't have all the answers, but we have a really great platform to allow us to start building the data and collecting it in such a way that we can continue to learn. And so onto this database, we're trying to add now the mammographic density and other kind of modifiable risk factors. And yeah, so I mean, it's job security because there's lots of work to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for this participant, if you're in the wisdom study, your polygenic risk score can change if we update or implement new models of polygenic risk scores, as Laura was mentioning, that are more specific and tailored. And that's, again, part of this continuous learning and, really trying to refine what we're doing and be more precise. Yeah. Okay. And then another person wanted to hear a bit more about cardiovascular risk factor examples in the breast.
Connie, you want to start?
Yeah. So, this is going to be the second product that we work on and develop. We've set up the pipeline to start to train that model. We're taking a different approach that a lot of groups are. A lot of groups have just decided it's all about the breast arterial calcifications, and their belief is that the calcifications that we see in arteries that run through the breast actually reflect the same kinds of inflammation and processes that can happen in the coronary arteries, and showing, if you have plaque in your coronary arteries and those calcify, you're going to see that in your arteries in your breast tissue as well. It's not that straightforward, and it's definitely a domain where the conclusion of the study, the highlight that's given as the one sentence conclusion, can sound very powerful and very exciting, but when you start to tease apart the studies, I doubt that the breast arterial calcification alone is going to do much in the field, except for perhaps bring a greater awareness of women that are undergoing screening mammography, that it's important for them to think about their heart health as well. So the approach that we're taking is more the approach we took with the breast cancer risk score, like allow the deep learning to see and find the signals itself. If you can have large enough numbers of mammograms with strong, accurate labels. So, and it's going to be a little bit more complicated with heart disease. So you could certainly say, well, we're going to build a model that doesn't predict breast cancer, yes or no, but it's going to predict the risk of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. Or you might say stroke, or you might say, high cholesterol, or we're going to try to train it to show what existing risk models for heart health have been trained to do. I really like the idea of having very clear outcomes that would be a bad outcome, like a myocardial infarction. That's a bad outcome, or death from myocardial infarction. And so we're setting that up, but we're going to be training a lot of intermediate risk processes in the model itself, and then just see which of these are most powerful. So it's very this domain of the mammogram predicting cardiovascular disease risk, and not only heart health but brain health. It's very new, so we're all going to be learning together pretty rapidly on a fast track, and it's really going to come down to quality data and marrying the strong databases that exist on quality mammograms with strong clinical outcome data in the domain of cardiovascular disease and basically heart health and brain health.
Great. All right. A question on breast screening. Is there a certain age after which mammograms are not needed?
Well, you'll see all the time, this all is so political, where, I just saw a flash on, an Aunt Minnie or something like, decreased breast cancer mortality in women screened in their 80s and 90s. And so then people get all excited and say you should screen forever. We know in Europe they stop screening much earlier than we do in the US. For how different our recommendations are in the US for screening, both when to start, when to stop, and how frequently to screen, for how different our recommendations are to Europe's, you don't see these dramatic differences in breast cancer mortality in the two countries, or in the two domains, in the US and then in Europe. So I think there's a reasonable age to stop. The American Cancer Society says if you have 10 quality life years left, you should continue to screen. And many of us emphasize if you are going to continue to screen, be really thoughtful about the interventions. Like, are you really going to biopsy some powdery calcs in an 85-year-old? And if so, why? So I think if you are going to keep screening, be really thoughtful about how you screen differently for older women, women after 75, for example, than younger women, and taking other factors into effect. But certainly when we have primary care doctors that say, I talked with my patient, she's 80, she doesn't want to keep screening mammography. What do you think? I was like, sounds great. That sounds great. I don't see any reason to continue screening at that point. We have other patients and their primary care doctors that feel very much it's a part of what they do, that they just don't want to feel like they've just given up on themselves. And so they continue to screen, and sometimes to the extreme. But I don't know. Laura, what do you all do at UCSF? When do you stop screening, or do you?
Well, I was just going to mention for wisdom, we do the e-prognosis assessment where we look to see what other competing health conditions someone may have, to assess if if their life expectancy is less than 10 years, it may not, screening may not benefit them as much. And so that's something we do. We just learned Mara Schoenberg, who is the tool we were using, her tool, the e-prognosis tool. There's now another one, or an update to that one, or an updated decision support tool that she's put out that we're hoping to build in to wisdom as well. But yeah, I think it is a gray area. There's some people who, again, feel very strongly that they want to continue with their annual mammograms, and others who are done and want to be done. But again, I think the risk-based approach of what is your risk? Is it still high? Is it still something that you should be screening for? So yeah. One more question on AI for you, Connie. How have you found patients are accepting AI into this space? Is there enough trust in the models and, just acceptability amongst the patient population?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's two ways I think about that. One, just as we've done somewhat informal, you know, um, um, opinion groups, etc., there seems to be a bit of an age differentiator. So in our older patients, and I would say like over 70, there's more of a, I don't know if I would trust this. In our women under 50, there's more of a, I think that sounds really smart and intriguing a little bit. Those are generalizations, but I would say there's definitely age, some cultural, some, differences there. But at the area where I've been really interested in, where I think things start to shift and change, is what context are we trying to introduce this in? And the context we have now is a large amount of confusion around breast density. And we have so many patients so frustrated because they're told they have dense breast tissue. They're told that they could benefit from an MRI. And they go back to their primary care doctor who says, that's crazy. Half of my patients have dense breast tissue, and I'm not going to be recommending screening MRI in half of my patients. That's crazy. I would ignore it and just keep getting your mammogram. So women are frustrated where they feel they're getting very mixed messages. And so to have something that could help inform them, and where the data is strong about that information, and also capture those women that we can see. I mean, it's pretty disheartening where I see that, half of our African American and Hispanic patients that develop breast cancer were completely missed by the traditional risk model approaches. I mean, it's just frustrating, and that there is that inequity. is frustrating. So I think some of it is if everything was incredibly clear and we were introducing something that was a little bit disruptive. I actually think we have a fairly disruptive system that we're trying to bring, hopefully, more accurate information to bring a little bit more order to a disordered system.
Great. Okay, a little bit of a different question. So we have someone who's a cancer care companion supporting people with breast cancer. What are key questions that they should ask their doctors about protecting heart health during and after treatment? And this person also works with a Spanish-speaking community. So protecting heart health during and after treatment for those who have breast cancer.
Well, I'm going to let Laura answer that because it's really very much the clinical domain. But I'll just say that when Laura and I were talking a bit before about research opportunities, I am very, very intrigued with when you're looking at a risk profile of a patient who's trying to make decisions about what type of treatment, if we had a robust AI-based cardiac health score, could that be helpful in making decisions for cancer patients? And how might that be an application? That's definitely a research topic. It's not anything that we studied or we're far from that. But then I'll really turn to Laura for the more generic question about women's heart disease risk and how they think about that as they're entering into treatment.
Laura, you might be on mute. Let's see. There we
The
go.
Rise Up for Breast Cancer meeting, we are really trying to think about, what are sort of a work in progress, and trying to think about if we're doing cycle control or people have actually things that they have to do, or the IVF or pregnancy, hormone replacement, osteoporosis. You don't want to treat osteoporosis when they get it. The window to treat that is here. Hormone replacement, it's very interesting because this was it's one of the criticisms of the Women's Health Initiative is that a lot, the endocrine, the estrogen got stopped, the estrogen alone arm got stopped because of the risk of heart disease. But that's because it was given in the 60s. But if you give it in the 50s, you can reduce heart risk. So, I think one of the things that we want to do is start filling in, how should we be thinking about, trying to think about all these different interventions that can make a difference, where if you're trying to prevent heart disease, we can start to think about it, well, maybe that's like here, but not here, in your age. So these are ideas that we're trying to look at, because it's not like you need to do it, that like hormone replacement in the 50s may be really quite different from hormone replacement in the 60s, right, where it could be riskier. And I think that's or you're combining things like beta-doxyphene, which is risk reducing with a little bit of estrogen, that could be something you do in your 50s or even early 60s. So I think these are all things that we are trying to think about and really try and reimagine how we think about prevention, and where we also think about, oh, if I have endometriosis, or if I have fibroids, or that some of the treatments for that are things that are antiprogestins that will definitely bring down density. But then we have to have tools that can quantify what the density is. And if we have tools from Mammo AI that tell us this is the bad density, these are the features, that out of those features that are the black box features, we can start to develop specifically what are they, what creates like background enhancement. We know that it's yes, estrogen signaling, but it's inflammation. And maybe one of the things that we want to do if someone is at risk for, a fast growing triple negative cancer, is to be thinking about the PCSK9 drugs, which reduce heart disease risk and breast cancer risk. So how do we get ourselves out of the box and start thinking about what we want to combine? to manage certain conditions and bring down breast cancer risk at every moment that we're thinking about it. Because I think it's not that anyone's been deliberate about not doing it. I mean, we got lucky with contraception, it brought down the ovarian cancer risk, but not because we designed it that way. We just got lucky. So we know enough that we can start thinking and start developing along this framework. So that meeting is, oh, I can put that up too. Hang on. I can show you, where is that? Yeah, so Rise Up. It's 19th to the 21st. Connie, actually, you guys should definitely have a presence there. We're going to be talking about and submit an abstract, actually. It would be good to submit an abstract on trying to come up with the features in AI density that can predict risk, that could be used as a modifiable risk factor so that we can start testing some of these new ideas. Anyway, so it's open to everybody, but that's the idea. We're trying to think a little bit more holistically about.
So one last question before we run out of time. And I know Irene or Renee, that your question was more for cancer patients and heart health. I'll follow up with Laura on that one and I can get back to you. But one of the last questions goes back to the when to stop screening. And it states, how do we reconcile the recommendation with the ACE to stop screening with the ACS data that the median age of diagnosis is 62 and women are most likely to be diagnosed in their 70s?
Well, again, what are you most likely to be diagnosed with? And you know, when, you know, there are, and we're going to learn also from our colleagues in Europe who are taking people in the bottom quarter of risk and screening them every 4 years. So I think that there are 40% of people who probably don't need to be screened that much or for that long. Don't forget, different countries have looked at, so for example, in the UK, screening is 50 to 65 every 3 years. You know, their mortality rates for breast cancer are not a lot higher than ours. So I'm not saying that I agree that that's the right thing. I don't think one size fits all for everyone. I think it should be risk-based, but you know, we have to generate that data. I think there are groups of people who are lower risk, so I think it's a matter of trying to track the risk. I mean, one of the things that I think that we're going to find is, you know, what we're looking for in wisdom is in the risk groups, we have highest, elevated, average, and lowest risk. You know, can we see a difference in the rate of breast cancers? You know, if we can, then we can keep pushing on that to really find the group of people who, you know, you don't have to screen so early. You can start later. Another, you know, it's good to think about other examples. Prostate cancer is a good one. They think they arbitrarily initially had set the PSA level at 4. That was a mistake. But it turns out if you have a PSA of under 1, your chance of getting prostate cancer is so low that it's not worth screening ever. That's about 40% of the population. So then it is useful to screen the other group of people. I think we can get there in breast cancer as well. So I think the decision to stop depends on 3 things. What is your underlying risk for breast cancer ever? What is your short-term risk? You know, that's something that Mammo AI can help you with. And what's your overall health? You know, in order for screening to help you, you have to have a life expectancy of at least 10 years. So, you know, if you have renal failure and, you know, cardiac, and you've had 5 heart attacks and have a really poor ejection fraction and your overall life expectancy is 5 years, you know, your risk for breast cancer is extremely low on the totem pole for you in terms of risk. So if you have many other risk factors. So these are all things, and it's not, you know, it's just that you've got to pay attention to what matters most. So I think more of what we need to do is put things into context. What's my risk of dying of other things? What's my risk of breast cancer? So if you're 75 and have a high risk for breast cancer, we recommend you keep screening. If your risk when you're 75 is lower than in that low risk group that we think shouldn't even be screening, great, you can stop screening. And that's our first pass. But then we've got the big data set coming from Europe where they're looking at this different ways that we'll combine with. It's super exciting. And then we have all the data coming from Mammo AI. So if there's some magic combination of the Mammo AI, lowest density, lowest polygenic risk, lowest no mutations, I think that can start to give us courage and confidence that, yeah, there are groups of people that just don't need so much screening, and then you can lower the burden of screening. That's actually wonderful, right? That's great. Like if you go in for a colonoscopy and you've had 2 colonoscopies and no polyps, they say come back in 10 years. Like most people aren't saying, oh, what do you mean? I want to come back next year. Like, these are, no. So these are the things that we want to be, always put your stuff in context and try and figure out how we can learn. So to me, it's getting the multitude of things together that we can use and pool. And for sure, the future is going to be some form of the mammographic AI plus, the increasing ability of that we have to be able to look at the background genetic risk and exposures and you're in the context of your overall health.
And that's it. Laura, just a quick plug for we just are starting to launch our environmental exposure surveys, looking at environmental and occupational and residential exposures through some surveys. So if you're part of the study, you'll likely be asked to fill these out. Again, just one more set of information that we're hoping will continue to help us refine our approach to risk assessment. In addition, with mammographic AI, as Connie presented on, is on our roadmap as well. So lots of exciting things to come. Connie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, just 2 things before we get off is I think that, where you live and the exposure. So the whole story of, why is it that people around in very underserved areas have higher grade cancers or higher risk? I don't know. We don't know that. Is there some kind of environmental exposure? Is this an environmental justice issue? We don't know. A lot of the veterans who've been exposed to different chemicals have asked us to look at these things. So if you are part of Wisdom and we ask you to fill out these surveys, we really encourage you to do that. We have a broad coalition representing, all ethnicities and all races. This is the kind of data set that we need to be able to move some of these new ideas forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Huge thank you to Connie for joining us and sharing your expertise and sort of getting us excited for what's to come, not just in Wisdom, but in other areas as well. So it was a great overview and I know I learned a lot, so hopefully others did as well.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks you all. I'll be watching for my environmental survey if it comes through.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Look,
all right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Connie, and thanks for calling me. Sorry about not getting you the link.
Yeah.
No,
And just